Kia ora koutou and welcome. We're very pleased to be back with you for our fourth Early Childhood Seminar series of 2022. The seminars we've shared so far this year have focused on showcasing research of staff and students from the University of Auckland Faculty of Education and Social Work and our colleagues from other New Zealand institutions. Today, we're delighted to have with us a colleague from further afield, Dr. Andi Salamon from Charles Sturt University in Australia. Andi will be sharing with us findings from her Jean Denton Memorial Scholarship Research Project, focusing on the emotional capital practices of infants in an Australian early childhood setting. The recording of this presentation will be available on our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel after the seminar. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask them, and Andi will respond to them at the end of her presentation. I'll now pass over to Dr. Maria Cooper to welcome and introduce Dr. Andi Salamon.
Thank you, Justine. Kia ora tātou katoa, talofa lava. It is my honour to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Andi Salamon, who is, and I know will always be, a teacher at heart. Andi is also a dedicated senior lecturer and researcher in the School of Education at Charles Sturt University in Australia. Andi's work speaks for itself. She was recipient of the 2016 Australian Beth Southwell Research Award for an outstanding educational thesis, and as Justine mentioned, the Australian 2018 Jean Denton Memorial Research Award for Early Childhood Education. Indeed, a lot of Andi's research work so far has focused on pedagogy with infants and toddlers and the social and emotional competence of these very young children. Her 20+ years of experience as a teacher and a leader in ECE means she understands the theory to practice link and ensures that her own research, including projects with colleagues, is accessible to a broad audience. Andi comes to us today with a strong advocacy for infants' rights and quality early years learning experiences for all children. This is evident in the very first sentence of her abstract, that infants have sophisticated social capacities from birth. Andi, we are honoured to have you contribute to our seminar series at the University of Auckland. We know that you will give our viewers much food for thought to consider in their own work with or interest in infants and toddlers. No mai, haere mai, welcome, Andi.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful welcome. I too am honoured to be here. I hope I do this wonderful space justice. And before I do start, I'd like to acknowledge the Gundungurra and Darug people whose lands I live on, and the Wiradjuri people whose land I work on, and is where the research I'm presenting today is from. I'd like to acknowledge and thank all the elders past, present and emerging for sharing their lands. And even though it was so beautifully outlined by Maria, I'm going to use this presentation as a part of the storying, where I acknowledge an Indigenous colleague and elder who invited us to consider acknowledging country as storying, where we acknowledge the stories of the people whose lands we are on and begin to share our own. And so this presentation attempts to offer a view into possibilities for play-based learning with infants and has implications for sophisticated approaches to infant pedagogy. And I'd also like to acknowledge, as Maria so excellently did, the Jean Denton Memorial Scholarship Research that I'm presenting and who I'm very grateful for funding part and making this research possible. And so to preface this presentation, again, as Maria has flagged, a part of my story is that even though I am a researcher and teacher of adults now, in my bones, I'm an early childhood teacher with a philosophy of respect and decades-long commitment to honouring infants' rights. And so the space I co-create with babies as a result of my experience and philosophy manifests in my research practices and it seems it is a space that babies enter willingly during the course of my research with them. The picture at left is from my doctoral work almost 10 years ago, and the one on the right is from only 1 year ago, the project I'm presenting today. Two different places and almost a decade apart, yet the pretty much exact same thing happened, whereby after sitting in their space, babies become interested in me and approach me as what the psychological literature has called an attentive, friendly stranger. This underpins my story as an advocate for infants' optimal lived experiences as a teacher and as a researcher. And so in sharing that part of my story with you, it's an extension of the research story today is an extension of my story as an early childhood researcher with a strong philosophy of social justice enacted through my own practices. I've also been a team leader and director of infant and toddler settings, but now as a teenager at university, with a focus over the years in my teaching on diversity and difference, infant and toddler development and learning, the pedagogy of relationships, and preparing pre-service teacher students for professional placement with babies and toddlers. In doing so, and through presenting this work, I hope to help more people better understand and engage with babies and toddlers in professional and playful ways that help us all. In doing so, I also hope to work towards sharing CSU's values of Yindi Amara Winangana, to learn how to live respectfully in a world worth living in, by adding insight to our work with our youngest citizens, being inclusive of them as having equal rights to a quality education, having impact by changing what we do with babies and toddlers to make a difference for them, their families, and wider communities. And so the project I'm drawing on aimed to document emotional capital practices, which I will get to in infant pedagogy, and engage in reciprocal ways as a participant observer. Sorry, I was just checking the chat in case it's for me. Hopefully we're all still good, which I think we are. And so I was a participant observer in the research with infant and educator participants. The resulting reciprocal outcomes included gifting interested babies my own experience, interest, and time, even if only for a few months. In return, I was gifted rich, detailed data about babies engaging in playful ways that, if sustained over time, I believe could directly impact positive, cognitive, emotional, and social learning. Play occurs in a variety of species and involves a range of activities that can be solitary or involve harmonious serve and return interactions. In humans, that can help support co-regulation and promote holistic child development. Play thus underpins a range of long-term benefits for children which can lead to lifelong well-being outcomes in adults. Research about the importance of play in young children's lives has significantly framed early childhood education practices worldwide for at least 20 years. However, children aged birth to 2 years have often been precluded from the research on which the practices are founded and its application in practice. Instead, there is a predominant focus on children aged 3 to 5 years and older, or when younger children are considered as is often described, there seems to be a focus on material and object-related play, which babies are not developmentally able to participate in for much of their first year. Piaget talks about sensorimotor play and certain ways that infant babies' cognitive development can be enabled But again, there's a constraint in terms of the focus on physical, because there's this notion that the objects have to be a part of that aspect of play. Parton has referred to infants and toddlers in her stages of play, but they're always almost considered unoccupied and solitary. There's been some useful impact of Parton's stages of play, especially for showing the importance of play, and that's changed practices. I'm checking again. I'm going to put the chat over here. That's changed practices in terms of play therapy. There's been a focus in the past 100 years where, you know, that research, that thinking has really helped to see the importance of play. But again, where are the babies? Where are the children under 2? The rigor of the research is questionable. The research in terms of contemporary application. The research was conducted in 1926 on 42 preschool age children with only 4 children under 2. Even though those stages of play are still used in early childhood education curricular documents, I argue that they need updating, especially when we consider a contemporary perspective, contemporary context, and all the useful, interesting, and sophisticated research that has since developed to help us see infants and toddlers' capacities in much more real ways than we're capable of in 1926. Vygotsky has written extensively about play, and certainly leading Australian ECE play researchers use Vygotsky's notion of imagination as a bridge between play and learning. They consider imagination as a mental process that helps children make meaning in their world. But when we focus on the use of play objects in imaginative ways with social peer participants, again, the application of this remains with older children. Experimental studies support the experience of play conditions that involve pretense or symbolic play with preschoolers. And that's particularly effective in preparing children for effortful problem solving and creative tasks that require a high level of metacognitive and self-regulatory skill. However, children are primed for learning at birth, and there is a significant gap in knowledge about the play-based learning with infants in early childhood education that underpins development of those skills and promotes cognition and self-regulation in the first few years of life. The project I am presenting today complements the developmental focus of recent Australian research that is investigating play-based models to promote science, technology, engineering, and mathematics learning through play-based models. And what I bring and add is a focus on early cognitive, social, and emotional aspects of infant development in everyday experiences. I think the last comment was meant to be, but do babies pretend? And so this top picture is of my son pretending to cry. Documented observations of him were similar to the ones I used to write in portfolios of babies that I spent my days with on the floor for 15 years. And thankfully, I have now documented and deconstructed the sophisticated things they were doing on babies that are not my own child. And these are called emotional capital practices. Emotional capital in this project is conceived of as the emotionally evocative and purposely used, emotionally evocative repertoire of skills infants effectively, actively, and purposely use in their lived social and emotional experiences. Emotional capital is a form of what Bourdieu calls symbolic capital. Bourdieu, as a theorist, wrote about and thought about and theorized symbolic capital as grounded in the production of different kinds of power that accumulate over time and that have a potential capacity to produce profits for the actors involved. And so this conception emerged in my doctoral research, whereby babies were engaging with this purposefully emotional, evocative communication as what seemed a form of currency. And so the top picture, the top picture is of my son pretending to cry. And in these middle pictures is a 10-month-old baby from my doctoral research who was overtly and over-exaggerating a smile towards another child and then directed it towards me. But that was really just a snippet. And she was doing these very particular things with her face and her eyes and her vocalizations. And similarly, at the bottom, you can see pictures that have come out of this recent project. And the faces are very similar, though the brow, through the brow, and depending on the emotion, an upturned and downturned mouth. And though there are similarities in the way individual children drew on emotional capital, there was nuance and variation. So the similarities, the over-exaggerated cry faces and over-exaggerated smile faces, cocking a head and vocalizing, pretending to blink and sneeze and laugh. So you'll see these more specifically in the next picture. And when theorizing, in the next slide, I'm sorry. When theorizing emotional capital, I proposed that babies take out and draw on a bank of emotional and social developmental understandings which have accumulated since birth. This project helped illuminate this by documenting this really evocative range of vocal and embodied enactment of their cognitive, social, and emotional learning. And it happened within the relationships that babies developed with their educators and other children. I use a practice theory approach, and I frame that enactment of observable actions and interactions as practices. And so using the theory of practice architectures, practices are bundles of sayings. So they're things we say and think, doings, what we do, and relatings, how we relate. And for babies, sayings, I consider, are spoken in the form of embodied and vocal communication, because usually it would be verbal language, but babies speak in embodied ways. And so it's through things, among other things, gaze, facial movements, intensities and types of cries. And it was this understanding of babies' sayings, doings and relatings that informed the ways in which babies' practices were analysed in the study. And so altogether, emotional capital practices are the intentional and sophisticated bundles of cognitive, social, and emotional behaviours that resulted in powerful, playful, and evocative social and emotional expression. And one of the really interesting things that came out of the project is these embodied, expressive, and evocative, what seemed to be emotional communication. In this project, it has shown that it's quite often social. And that's where the sophistication comes in. So there's a cognition around it, and researchers over time, Trevarthan and Vasudevi Reddy, have written about children as social clowns, children who clown around. So they're using this evocative expression in social ways. And that in itself is quite sophisticated. And so though I'm here to talk about, and what you see here are some examples of the different children. And like I said, they all seem to have their own way of though some parts were similar, there was a uniqueness in how each child expressed what they knew. And though I'm here to talk about play with infants, a part of what I kind of present when I present the research is the research itself, and considering it as intentional research in similar ways as certainly in Australia, we talk about intentional teaching. And so there are a number of aims and outcomes in mind. And from now on, I'm going to share the ways the aims played out, some of the intended outcomes, and also some unintended outcomes. And the first aim was to document these emotional capital practices, this evocative and sophisticated emotional communication that babies can use. And so in terms of the research, it was an active process. I use a strengths-based way of relating to and with children and families, colleagues, and the profession and industry, environments and the influences on them, and making a number of purposeful research decisions and actions. And as I flagged, what ended up happening was the intended outcomes of the project became balanced with these shifts in choices based on particular situations and what scholars call the happeningness of moments during the day, the happeningness, those moment-to-moment in situ ways that a moment can turn, especially with babies, very quickly. And over the course of the project, my plan shifted based on the happeningness of these interactions with the children and also with the educators. And among the strategies we're making to manage included making professional judgments through evaluation and critical reflection of my plan and how it might be shifting, and reflecting on those unintended outcomes that resulted from the shifts. So in relation to intentional teaching, there came to be a balance of both planned and emergent experiences. So this is one of those moments where I do have videos to share, but I'm told that it might be, I'm going to stop sharing that screen, and I'm going to start sharing this one to hopefully make sure that the videos are as good as possible. So here are some examples of emotional capital practices, those evocative ways that the babies were communicating. Some of them are very quick, and so I'm happy to direct you to them and say, watch for this, but hopefully this will work. Here's the first one. There was some flapping and this kind of measured vocalization. And that was a quick one. Now this child, the context of the rest of the video is that it was during a meal time, and this child's eyes were on the watermelon. And because I was a very privileged, person in this space as a researcher, it's quite easy to sit on the side and watch while many things are happening. But the educators did not notice until we watched the video together that she had her eye on this watermelon. And so essentially she was it seemed as though she was asking, or she was kind of, that bid was toward that end. So there was this combination of vocal, embodied, facial expression. Oh dear, we cannot play that one. How about that one? Oh, what a shame. That one isn't going to work either. So sorry about that. I'll stop sharing and I'll go back to the other. And so if the outcomes were, so that was just a snippet of the emotional capital, or just babies' practices as embodied. There are certain sayings and thinkings, you know, that are evident. They do certain things and they relate in certain ways as among their actions and interactions with us. And so if the outcomes were a reciprocal research partnership, which they were, between myself, the research site, families, educators and children, another outcome was to develop understandings about infants and toddlers' emotionally evocative communication. As a researcher, I had to ask what methods would I use to achieve those outcomes? How am I planning on achieving those outcomes? And again, in terms of intentional play-based learning with infants and toddlers, or in Australian contexts, we plan for certain things. We use our observations of children to decide what to do next. And so for me, the bigger purpose was achieving the aims of the project. And you can see here some of the planned methods I used were what I call the map. And so that was a way to include, so that was the theory that I used, the theory of practice architectures, and I would bring it into meetings with the educators. And this is what you can see in the middle on the top, is that we would watch snippets of data, I would share videos, and we would decide, well, what's a saying, what's a doing, what's a relating. Sometimes it wasn't as clear, that it was just, you know, it wasn't as easy as, you know, this is one and this is the other. Sometimes they were combined. But the map as the focus of the meetings was about sharing the analysis and including the educators as participants in the project in analysing the data, because they knew the children better than I did, certainly as a researcher. Another planned method was having babies in the meetings. So including them as part of the process meant that I had to make a conscious choice about, well, if they were going to be there, what's the right and fair, you know, how can I include them in ways that are meaningful for certainly and respectful of their time? And so making this conscious choice to have the babies in the meetings meant that what I planned to have something for them to do while we were discussing the data. And in my PhD, I developed this method based on documentation, pedagogical documentation, where I used the photos that I'd taken of the babies in the first few weeks and I laminated them. And I then shared them with the babies. And, you know, as a young researcher / early childhood teacher / researcher in disguise, I thought, you know, we could watch the babies and see what they did with the photos, and it would tell us something about, you know, what they were interested in, and that could guide the next step. But really, they, you know, I think their experience of the photos was more in that sensory motor way that Piaget described. So they ate them and they used them to slide around, and that was fine. You know, I think it's more about what I've called in the past the methodological attitude of ethical symmetry, where, you know, I acknowledge that I'm coming into their space. And so it seems right to me and fair to include them in ways, at least while I'm there. And the other part of sharing the research was sharing the research with educators and families. And that was at a presentation night at Centre. And the photo at the bottom in the middle is an example of that. And the parents really enjoyed, I mean, in my experience, parents always enjoy seeing what their children are doing during the days, but especially when they're a part of research. And in the pictures, you can also see some of the beginnings of those unplanned experiences emerging as the babies themselves started to impact on the experience. Because when you are in a space with babies, again, even though I'm an attentive, friendly stranger, you know, they're interested. They're the sharpest people on the land. You know, when I walked into that space, I had at least 5 babies just staring at me, deadpan for minutes, which is quite confronting for some, but quite refreshing to me. So over time, they began to be interested in my things, and they approached me. You know, it was pretty common that I'd look behind me, and I had a few different cameras. There was always someone had found something of mine. So over the course, their active engagement with me began to shift the course of the plan, and ultimately the results and outcomes of the project. And so, you know, those were the participatory methods that I built in. And as I said, there was, you know, since my PhD, I've been observing and reflecting on and developing this ethical line of myself as a researcher who is really an early childhood teacher and a native in early childhood education environments. And what seemed to happen was that my capacity to engage in praxis, which is outlined here. Again, it's that notion of, well, what do we do in those happening moments, in those moments where things start to shift. That was grounded in my background experience and resonance with and understanding of babies, as well as in similar ways as we do as educators, through critical reflection and this series of planned and unplanned things happening. And so some of the snips you can see are a part of that critical reflection that I worked to doing the right thing, in scare quotes, obviously. But in those moments as they emerged, I drew on my networks. And I also at the same time was watching, I was doing some literature review of developmental research about emotion, infants' emotional and social development. And I was also watching, and that's where the attentive, friendly stranger term came from. But I was watching the Netflix series Babies and seeing the developmental researchers hold, cuddle, smile and engage with babies they're about to put into MRI machines. And I thought, well, if they're doing it, I can do it. If the developmental researchers are doing it, I can do it too. And it brought me to realize, because I'd always had this notion that as a researcher, I had to be separate. But it helped me see that it was okay to engage with the babies. And it was written into my ethics, which is a part of the research process, that if the babies approached me, I would respond. Or if they smiled at me, I would smile back. Because in fact, it would be unethical not to. But the specific context of this centre and the timing of the year, it was early in the year, including new children and staff, meant that there were many crying babies. And as an attentive, friendly stranger, they came to me often. And so this series at the bottom on the left, for example, was my first morning on the floor, as well as this baby, Octavia. And it was her first ever morning on the floor as well. And she had been crying after being dropped off. And I had observed her. I tried to sit in the corner up against the bookshelves like I do. And I had observed her crawling from lap to lap. She approached parents and educators. She was reaching up and seemed quite upset. And I was sitting at a wall near a bookshelf and again, trying to be separate, but she literally crawled into my lap. And it seemed that she was seeking comfort. And you can see at that point, because it was day one, my hand here, I kind of kept it closed on my lap. I didn't touch her because at that point, I still thought that as a researcher, I needed to keep some distance. But over the course of the weekly visits, and as I flag in the coming slides, I came to reconcile my researcher, human, experienced early childhood teacher self with helping in certain ways. And again, I say helping. And for this child, it meant a far more positive experience as an outcome in the setting over time. And so you can see at the beginning, you know, I was still unsure, but once I had done that big work of really critically reflecting on how I be as a researcher, it felt okay to engage. And so, you know, you can see that she ended up feeling comfortable with me. She came onto my lap and we ended up, I want to say, being friends and having some fun time together. But again, babies are sharp. And so we know that there's a really unique and useful contribution, I think, in terms of that ethical line and understanding our roles and really being mindful and purposeful and careful about how we be and what we choose to do. And it was interesting as a researcher to have to kind of negotiate that. And so here we can see that I didn't plan to engage in these ways, but what ended up happening was that I noticed they were interested during the meetings in more than the laminated pictures. And so I started, and this was all in consultation with the staff. And I decided to bring in some resources. I chose them intentionally, you know, in terms of their developmental basis. So here, for example, I brought in old business cards and some tissue boxes I found at the centre. And I chose those based on the notion of posting. I didn't plan to bring those in, but by evaluating how the meetings were going and having those professional conversations and using my own professional judgment, I made that choice. And all the time I was critically reflecting on my researching practices, which again was part of the method, and evaluating those, making ethical decisions. And what ended up happening was that the babies started engaging with me. I wasn't that much of a stranger anymore. And I think that participatory space resulted from that day-to-day engagement, from not doing that, not just with the babies, but also with the educators who, because in developing relationships with them, I learned that they had not experienced having a qualified early childhood teacher in the babies room. And I say babies as birth to 1-year-olds compared with quite often, and this is an interesting thing that's come out of this project, is a real clear sense, certainly in Australian contexts, that quite often babies are, I want to say, lumped. You know, they're grouped together in either the under 3s or under 2s. And there's a very unique space in the birth to 1 space. And so, you know, these educators who, some of the context there is one of them had never worked in an infant toddler space until that week. So for them, it was quite interesting. They noticed my interactions with the babies, and then they were asking me questions about my history as a director and teacher of a 30-place infant and toddler setting. So it was interesting, again, in terms of that line between myself as a researcher and a teacher, that they were very interested in me as well. And I won't play that video because it takes too long to fiddle, and I'm aware of time. So I'll keep going. But what ended up happening, well, I'll just speak to this slide. And I brought in some resources, and I had these small group experiences. And it was wonderful, and there was singing, and, you know, part of the context was that the babies started to expect when I sat down with a book, or some of the ones that were able to move. That was a really interesting thing, but also it was such a lovely thing to see the educators experience what quality learning experiences and pedagogy can look like. And through those relationships, and again, given who I am, so that was one example of group experiences, but it also happened that I began to play in individual small kind of interactions. So I started playing with the babies and drawing on what I know about their developmental capacities again. For example, that interest in my professional experience, pretending to sneeze and cough and blink and be coy, was this real, it kind of sparked a playfulness in the babies. And so we played through mutual playfulness. And I initiated what I've done for decades and encourage my students to do, and I call it the sneezing game. And the way it works is I put a block on my head and I pretend to sneeze, and I build it up and I go, and I don't think I've got the full video here, but when I do that, there's this real anticipation, there's this real sense that I can feel that they're waiting, and then I go, choo, and when I sneeze, the block falls off my head. And it's this very funny and silly game, it seems, but it's playful, and it seems, again, I'm just going to try and share my screen, the other screen. They seem to enjoy it. What was interesting is, you know, it was my professional experience that I draw on to play that game here. And you can see here the groups that would gather around to play. Even though it was one-on-one, it wasn't planned. It just, there was the block, I put it on my head. And so here we go. Two. Hudson, you think it's funny too. Two. And so what you, I mean, again, that's a really small snippet, but this game went on for quite a while. And this was the first day that we started, and this baby was laughing, and that, you know, over the course of at least 30 minutes, you know, again, one of those things that babies aren't meant to do is have a focus and a long attention span. Some of these babies stayed in with me engaged for 30 minutes. So I think when we start to reframe what play looks like, and rather than it being about playing with a train or playing with a truck, you can play with ideas, you can play with expectations, and you know, it seems to engage babies in play-based learning, but just not in the classic way we have learned about play-based learning. So here's another example. I think this was late, no, this may be the following week. Sorry, and before I go on, I just encourage you to look around and see what happens. Really, be playful and they will come. And so this is a week after we started playing the sneezing game. And I'll stay in this mode because this, what ended up happening is that the babies were starting to choose to play the sneezing game after only a few days doing it in the week before. But it was a very powerful moment here when this person approached me, and I thought she was handing me one of those business cards that I made a very big mess in this space with. But she had a different idea, and you can tell that it kind of took me by surprise, but it was a really wonderful outcome, I think, and finding, certainly about cognitive capacity and babies' active engagement, their agency, their choice to engage in such ways.
What are you feeling? Bless you. Gosh, everything's happening over there. There's coughing and sneezing. Hey, Sasha.
I was setting up to read a book.
Should we read this one? You reckon yours not coming in? Oh, it's on. She's not on the roll. She's not
This is
on
the one
the
to keep an eye on.
Wednesday like application. And on that phone, we have and whoop whoop there, here whoop there, whoop everywhere, whoop whoop. Thank you. Oh my goodness, look, that's you. You're playing that game. Ready? Two. Evelyn wanted to play that game, I think. You didn't like my singing.
So what it seemed as though was that she wanted to play that game, and she moved all the way over. The fact that she remembered that game, she associated me with that game. They're all such telling, you know, examples of those sophisticated skills that we can often miss, that we can take for granted. And it was, this was actually, sorry, I forgot to say, this was 4 weeks later, I came back for 4 weeks. And so this was the week later, but after 4 weeks, the parents were telling me that the children were playing this game at home, that they would kind of give them something and make a sound, even though the parents didn't completely understand what the game was. But the impact, I think, also on educators was based in that praxis. So again, for them to see that changed their perspectives. And so by noticing the active participation, the engagement in the sneezing game, you know, they were drawing me to do these things again. And when I came back at the end of the month, not just the parents were telling me, but the educators said that they had been playing the game while I was away, bringing random things that, you know, both the children and the educators, and it turned into this game for everybody. So I think I'm around the right time. What has emerged from the project is a view of infants as playful, as purposeful, and as sophisticated social and emotional learners and companions. All the things they're not given much credit for. But as I often think, if they're doing this as babies, how good could they be as toddlers? And what does it mean for the pedagogical spaces that we invite them into? I'm really very excited to have shared the project. And if you'd like to be in touch about anything, I trust you've seen my email address at the bottom of the slides. So for now, thank you very much. And hopefully we have this was good enough and interesting enough. And we've got some things to discuss, some questions to talk about.
We do indeed, Andi. Before I get to these questions that I see in our Q&A, I just want to say ngā mihi nui kia koe. Thank you for such an insightful presentation about your meticulous and interactive research with, as you said, the sharpest people on the planet. Your focus on ways to be a reflective and ethical researcher with infants was clear. And I loved your statement that babies speak in embodied ways. And also the idea of relating to and with infants and toddlers, which in one way suggests an embodied pedagogy as one meaningful response. I hope I speak on everyone's behalf who's part of this webinar, but I want to thank you for your respect and thoughtful attention paid to, as you said, our youngest citizens in ECE. So you have definitely provided some food for thought in relation to working and being with infants and toddlers. And now I'm going to go to some of these questions, which I think are excellent. And the first question comes from Pauline, who says, I love your work. It's very interesting and stimulating. Are you familiar with the work done on moral choices on babies as young as 4 months of age?
No, I've got myself a pen, but I haven't got any paper around me to write that on. I am not. I'm interested though. Model choices.
Moral choices.
Moral choices.
Yeah.
Of the babies. No.
Okay, that's a good area to look into.
Mm.
Thank you, Pauline. We'll note that for you, Andy.
Okay.
And then another question from Professor Carmen Darling says she loves the images of babies engaging with their peers. Can you share a bit more insight about babies' peer interactions, please?
I caught some really wonderful snippets about the babies interacting with each other. And I guess in the context of this, so one of the most powerful ones was I had noticed these babies who do these things. There was there was this embodied interaction or engagement of the babies, and one thing they would do was lean in. It was a bit like watching gorillas kind of go, you know, they use their body right up in the face of another baby, and I watched one come right up close to the face of another child and then back away. And so I think the babies were doing these things with each other as well. I think maybe depending on the response of the baby that had the child up in their face off, it seemed as though if the response didn't match, and I guess that touches on attunement, is that perhaps you know, there's a less sophisticated response from another baby depending on that child. I think that's where some things like temperament and personality, what I started to be interested in is which babies were doing it, because not all the babies were doing it. And so I actually have a really lovely clip about how one baby copied me being silly and crazy, and it made another baby laugh. And so I could see that the baby that copied me, I was imagining her as like a comedian, and the child that laughed as being in the audience. You know, we're not all comedians. So yeah, I think it was there was a lot there, and I think that's another part of the way that babies are underestimated. And one of the striking thing that came out of my PhD, I remember, you know, the ways that babies interact with each other quite often are ways that educators will stop the baby. So they might poke you in the eye, for example, or touch your hair, for example. And that quite often what happens is we say, no, don't touch them, you know, versus why don't we just wait and see what happens, you know, and because how will they interact with each other if they don't learn, you know, maybe that baby is okay with having their face touched. We have to wait and see.
Great. Thank you, Andy. I want to go to a question in the chat that wasn't quite put into the Q&A, but that's okay because it relates to this idea of peer interactions. And it comes from Leanne Turton, and it says, do you think a shift to mixed-aged spaces would benefit infants and toddlers beyond the developmental organisation of ECE spaces with babies in aged-based spaces? Is that clear to you?
I guess the first thing that comes to me in response is, I think any kind of effort to just make a standard, let's mix the age group. I wonder if it's more about the kinds of children, because I think older children who, you know, it's about matches and mismatches of personality, temperament, ways of being versus age. So I guess even within that, there's a nuance, because if some older children would enter a mixed space that doesn't enable younger babies, because the other thing to think about or to keep in mind with that is babies as being, or very younger children as being less used to often that sensory busyness that older children can bring. And so I guess it's about it's the answer that my students hate. It depends. It depends on the children and the space and the centre. I think it can work, but not just as a standard thing.
Great, thank you. We have a question about the word sneeze. And Karen is asking, I wonder if the word sneeze that you used in the dialogue before your song gave the baby another connection to the sneezing game as well. What do you think?
I don't actually talk about sneezing. I just do it. I don't think I say I sneeze when I'm with them. I just called it that afterward. I'd never called it that before. So I think even in the video I said play that game. It could be, but if anything, I would say probably more as an association with the game. So I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question, but in terms of the word itself, I'm guessing that they might get used to it. And if I said the word, they would understand that that was that game. Maybe I've misunderstood the question.
No, that's okay. That sounds great.
Okay.
There is a comment about how interesting it was that the educators were observers of you and how that changed their perspective. And that relates to a question from Janet Gaffney, Professor Janet Gaffney. Andi, did the teachers and parents share what they learned from observing you interact with their babies?
They did. And I know that as part of each of my times doing a focused project, I've often, so a part of, like I say, a part of what we do is we have the meetings built in, and I build it into their existing days so that there's no extra time on the educators, and they refer to it as a form of professional development, and they talked about, you know, we ended up having conversations about theorists, and there was an Indigenous girl who loved, I'm afraid to say it, but can I say it? I'm looking at Maria to try and decide.
I don't know what you're going to say.
I know. Well, just thinking about theorists as old white dudes, you know, and I say it with respect to the time and place from whence they came, but really it's about being critical. And one of the things that I do in talking about developmental milestones and developmental theory is it's saying, you know, they're useful theories, but we have to be critical about who's written it and where the research comes from. But for her, it was such a refreshing take, especially helping her realize she could be critical. And because I say the thing to do is to look at the children in front of us first, you know, and then decide what theory works to help understand it, what research might help. And if it does help, it makes sense. And if it does help plan for learning, then that's great. But start with children, I think. And so that was quite refreshing for that. Again, it was a form of professional development. And I had one of the, when I did this, my doctoral research, I had the teacher on the other side of the space. I was with the birth to twos, and the director actually asked me to come back and do the same thing with the 2 to 3 space. So, and I think for the parents as well, it was quite an eye-opener to really break it down. And I think also one of the really useful things that they found was to see their own practice by watching the videos, because when you're in it, you don't notice quite a lot that's going on around the space. So they quite appreciated, I think, having time to notice what the babies were actually doing without, you know, cleaning the floors and getting lunch. And
we've got a lot to learn from infants in terms of being very sharp and attentive with what's going around them. Okay, Andy, I'm going to just end the discussion there because we are out of time. And I just want to say what a wonderful job you've done. Thank you so much for advocating for our younger citizens. And I know our viewers have enjoyed this presentation like I have. I'm now going to pass over to Justine.
Kia ora, Maria. So I can only add to Maria's thanks, Andy, for sharing your work with us this evening. It's clear from the questions that we've had that your work's really struck a chord with our audience, and I'm sure that they would probably quite happily stay on and have more questions for quite a lot longer. So hopefully we'll be able to get you here in person at some point to share your work further. And your identification and discussion of the sophisticated social capacities that infants have from birth really resonates with Te Whāreki's image of children as competent and confident learners, strong in their identity, language and culture. So you've really added to our kete of knowledge and have affirmed the value and importance of the early years and the work that we're all doing in this space. So thank you so much.
thank you.
So we really hope that everyone watching has found this seminar thought-provoking. In fact, I know you have, and that it's provided inspiration for your own practice and thinking about children's emotional capital practices. If you would like to revisit the ideas that Andy shared in the seminar, please do check out the recording on our YouTube channel that will be up within a day or two. And we look forward to seeing you all back for our next seminar, which will be on Monday, the 30th of May, with another Australian colleague, Dr. Tamara Cumming, who will be sharing her research related to teacher wellbeing and early childhood workforce sustainability. So keep an eye on your inbox for the flyer and registration information. But thank you again, Andy, for your wonderful presentation. And thank you to everybody who has joined us this evening. Kia kaha, kia ora, kia ata whai, ka kite anō.